So in this next session, we're going to go a little deeper into the economics of what we've been talking about this morning. There have already been references to the fact that over the last 2 decades, we have had extraordinary reduction in poverty. By World Bank figures, we've gone from about 30% of the world's population in extreme poverty 20, 25 years ago to roughly 10% today. There's never been anything quite like that in the history of the world. And yet, as we've discussed, there's increasing concern about the inequality within societies driven by globalization and technology as well. And we're going to dive into that from a global perspective a little bit now with a great panel that I'd like to introduce. First of all, Hernando de Soto, who is the president of the Institute of Liberty and Democracy in Lima, Peru. Hernando. I know he's back there somewhere. And then Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala, who is the former managing director of the World Bank. Hernando, why don't you sit right here? Former managing director of the World Bank and former finance minister of Nigeria. If you could take the middle seat. And Larry Summers, professor at Harvard and former Treasury Secretary. Thank you. And Larry, I'm going to make you go first, if you're willing, and give us the global picture. We've been talking a lot this morning about both the dramatic reduction in poverty we've seen, but increasing concern about inequality within societies. From an economic perspective, how should we be thinking about this?
Well, start with this: a rich person in India is much poorer than an average person in the United States or Europe. So if you start from that, and you know that growth has been much more rapid in China and India than it's been in the rich world, you know that on a global basis, there's been substantial convergence. And so if you measure inequality across all people, it has gotten much smaller, but that's because the poor places have grown faster than the rich places over the last generation. If you look within places, within most societies, those who are better off have done better than those who are worse off, and those at the top have done best. So in very round numbers for the United States, if the United States had the same income distribution today that it had in 1979, the top 1% of the population would have about $1 trillion less, or about $750,000 less per person. The 80th to the 99th percentile would have about the same as they do, and the bottom 80% would have about $1 trillion more, which would be about 25% more per person, or about $8,000. That phenomenon is more pronounced in the United States, but through most of the industrialized world, the two phenomena of a pulling away of people at the very high end and a general increase in the return to skill is what one sees. And one sees some of that as well in many of the developing countries. You have to have one way of thinking about all this. It would be that it used to be that if you wanted to combine smarts with work, they had to be right next to each other. And so when George Eastman had a great idea, which was photography, he got really rich, and Rochester was a thriving middle-class city for 2 generations. And now, because of technology, you no longer need to have the same degree of proximity between the entrepreneurial function and the execution function. And so when Steve Jobs has a great idea, he gets very, very rich, and the employment he generates and the way in which it pulls people up is spread over the whole world in a way that makes a much smaller contribution that people are able to see. And so basically, because you can combine industrial world talent with developing world labor, it is good for superstars, and it is good for developing country labor, and the labor that used to benefit from being proximate to superstars is squeezed. And that's what elected Donald Trump, and that's the reason we see more inequality.
Larry, I want you to take that one more step before we move on, because you talked about spreading the labor. The proximity is no longer necessary. You can spread the labor around the world. But there also seems to be a phenomena in technology where reproducing digital products doesn't require the same amount of labor. And so you look at a Google or a Facebook, they're simply not employing that many people.
It is both. It is. You're absolutely right, Alan. And I was going fast. Fundamentally, if you're a Mark Zuckerberg type, you have more leverage, and you have more leverage in part because once you have your idea, because of technology, it's zero marginal cost to produce more of it because you don't have to hire anybody. And to whatever extent you do, you can go anywhere in order to hire them. And so the pressure is coming both from the rest of the world and from technology. Or to put another analogy in your mind, manufacturing almost everywhere is going through what agriculture went through, only it's going through it much more rapidly than agriculture went through it. Fundamentally, it used to take half the population to feed the whole population. Now it takes 1% of the population to feed the whole population. Something similar is going on with respect to manufactured goods, and that's why everybody knows that there's much smaller share of the population is doing manufacturing work in the United States. What comes as more of a surprise to people is that the fraction doing manufacturing work in Germany, which is the great manufacturing success of the industrialized world and which is running a 9% of GDP surplus, and their share is way down. And even in China, on some calculations of the statistics, there are fewer industrial workers than there used to be.
And that's the perfect segue, Ngozi. Larry has given a nice depiction of the picture in the developed world, but you're feeling these pressures in African countries as well, right?
Yes, I think Larry has laid out the broad picture, and it is true that as far as the developing world is concerned, particularly in East and South Asia, but even in Africa, there have been benefits of this globalization. It has created jobs. There are some estimates that up to a third of the population on the continent are, middle class, but the definition of middle class, we'll have to look at what that really means. If people living on $20 of income, if that is, but be that as it may, there have been benefits through trade that have come through cheaper consumer goods that people have been able to buy. But I think what has not been focused on are the costs. And it's really interesting to me that now the phenomenon has really hit. It's been hitting developed countries, but now it's led to this new type of nationalism and populism. People are paying attention to the losers. We have had losers the winners and losers of this game have not been as well analyzed as they should be. And on our continent, I don't think the type of attention paid to the losers of the globalization game has come, and hopefully now we'll really focus on it. So what do I mean by that? At the same time, we've benefited with, demand from China for primary products, which has led to creation of jobs in the mining, the oil, the extractive industries, and exports that have pulled up large numbers of people. I think the poverty, people living under absolute poverty of about $1.90 a day has gone from about 60% on the continent in 1997 to about 41% now. So it's gone down, but not fast enough. But on the other hand, we've lost manufacturing jobs. Manufacturing was nascent in many countries, and it's taken a backward step. And I'll just illustrate to you, we've lost, in my own country, Nigeria, over 2 decades. We went from 600,000 jobs in the textile industry to about 20,000 today. In South Africa, a study just showed that over a decade, they've lost 75,000 jobs in textiles, in shoe, in electronics, and some machinery. So this is the kind of impact we're seeing. And I brought my bag on because there's something I want to, to show people of what this means. It so happens that as I was preparing to come here, I found some interesting stuff that had been given to me by textile manufacturers in my country as they complained about the impact of this globalization. So here is something, and I'd like to pass it around. I discovered this. This is made by United Nigerian Textiles, UNTL, and you can see they brought it to me as when I was finance minister to show me what was happening to them, and it's labeled real, right? This is the same, this is a manufacturer from China, and they've labeled it fake. And it also has the UNT label on it. This comes in at a couple of dollars less. So you can buy this for about $15 for 6 yards, and this for about 12 or 10. And it's completely wiping them out, taking all the jobs. And that's why we've gone from 600,000. I'm not saying it's the only thing. Of course, there's the fact that they may not have invested in machinery, issues with power. Yep. But this is just to let you know, and you can see, bills of this cloth, the fake and the real one, they're so close. And they said, we can't compete. This is wiping us out. So I would really like to pass it around for people to see, because it's one thing to sit and talk about this in abstract, and it's another.
It's fascinating. It's more. So what you're saying is that the demand for resources that globalization has created has lifted a lot of people out of poverty, but the diversity of the economy has suffered.
It has left our economies in the same, the same mode. There's been no structural change or transformation of our economies, because we've been able to export primary products the same way, not even transforming these along the value chain. And the small efforts we began to really transform and move into manufacturing jobs and so on has been decimated by this. So I just want us to know, so I'm one that feels globalization has delivered certain very important gains, but we also need to think about the losses and the losers. And we've not often focused on that, and that's where the problem lies.
Yeah, so we're going to come back to that in just a minute, but Hernando, you have a different geographical perspective coming from Peru. Can you talk about the problem, the dimensions of the problem as you see it?
Well, this is embarrassing, but I find that maybe the way to come directly to the point is not to talk about Peru, but to talk a place that was much more in the news, like the Middle East.
Okay.
Okay, and it relates to the word structure. We said things have changed, but structure's there, and I think I saw a conference, I forget where, just last night, where I saw Larry perform and talking about whether macroeconomics was a policy issue or something basically structural that's wrong that we haven't gotten at. So, Middle East, Arab Spring, 2011, a gentleman called Mohammed Bouazizi self-immolates. He actually did it the year before. Burns, dies. Within a period of 2 months, January and February 2011, the Arab Spring begins because another 64 people that we have identified burn simultaneously and bring down 4 governments. Why do I bring this into place? Because we actually went over 3 years to identify who were these people who had self-immolated. So we talked to their families, and we were able to see that about 37 had actually survived their burns. They had been extinguished with blankets. But when they were burning, they made statements. You don't go out and burn to say nothing. It's because you have to shout something. We have all their tapes. We did their bios. They were all businessmen. There wasn't one exception. They were all entrepreneurs. And they had 2 words that had in common. One was the word expropriation. And the other one that was interesting was ras el mel, which is I'm out there to protect my capital. So the question is, whatever got all these people from the Middle East and North Africa moving on the streets, we didn't hear one word. In all the tapes we've got, this is available in a documentary we now have, I think, in public broadcasting system, comes out every 3 times a week. It's called Unlikely Heroes. And there isn't one word about Islam and religion, and there isn't one word about politics. It's all about expropriation. So here's the part that's interesting, is that we never got that far in Latin America. But if you go back to find out where our revolutions came over time, it was entrepreneurs that didn't make it. Our social conflicts in the mines are miners that can't get the deals, that can't get the credit, that can't get the capital, among other things because they are not identified in the books in any way, whether it's their property rights, their individual rights. There's something wrong with the legal structure that doesn't allow them to actually work inside the market, and which we, the westernized Latin Americans, and we, the westernized Middle Easterns, take for granted. But we're a very small part of the economy. We were just trying to figure out now, sorry.
Yeah, go ahead.
We were trying to figure out now how many, for example, Peruvian companies could actually benefit from the bilateral trade agreements we have with the United States. And the reply is, of companies, it's about only 3 to 4%.
So what you're saying is that this globalization that we talk about is really only a phenomenon for a sort of a thin layer at the top of society. And that beyond that, there are fundamental property rights issues that make it difficult to participate.
Beyond that, there are problems that don't have to do with globalization per se, but that have to do in our own countries with the progress of the Industrial Revolution that came with lots of legal transformations. For example, I've been to Nigeria, lovely country. And I remember I was having dealings at that time with, I think it was President Obasanjo, and he told me, look, if we were to formalize or go out and title and create identity pieces for all of Nigeria, how much would that cost me? I said, well, I didn't know anything about Nigeria. I just met him in a conference in Monterrey, and I picked up an almanac in the airport on the way, and I said, well, given the fact that you are about 140,000, he said, well, 140,000.
Million.
140 million.
Then, we are 180 now.
He said, we're already 180. You can go to places in Latin America where they tell you we must be about 3 million to 6 million. Mm-hmm. Okay? So we are literally not at a stage of documentation where we can actually work in the market economy, which was your situation in the 19th century.
So I'm going to come back to that in a minute, but let's turn the conversation now to solutions, Larry. I mean, given the problem as you've diagnosed it, what is it that we need to do, and particularly the people in this room need to do to address the issue?
I'd say a few things. One, there's no single answer. Two, you deserve more credit for doing what you every day do well than you get, which is by producing products in ever better or more efficient ways and making everything people need to buy cheaper. You are making them richer and enabling them to live better lives. And that is a very substantial accomplishment, which we do not give credit for. Third, you need to support functioning, viable educational systems that are oriented to teaching people to do things that machines can't do, to cooperate with other human beings, to work effectively in teams. I mean, the clearest evidence that education needs a total reinvention is the fact that in every high school in America, they teach people trigonometry. And I don't know of anyone who does surveying anymore and has cause to think about the cosine of an angle. Whereas every one of us and everyone who works with us has cause to be involved with the concept of probability or standard deviation or rudimentary data analysis, and that's not taught in 15% of high schools, and there's corresponding versions of that throughout the developing world. Fourth, you have to, if you want to make your contribution, you have to make sure, as most of you do, most of the time, that you are making your money by providing a better service at a bit lower cost to people who want to buy it, rather than in some way by extracting it from the broader society, by using public policy to achieve a monopoly, by successfully litigating for a tax break or a subsidy of some kind. Not a trivial part of that transfer from the bottom 80% to the top 1% is resources that are going to the successful seekers of rents. And I think that's a prism through which it is useful to look at a large amount of inequality. I think that's as long a list. I could go on, but I think that's as long a list as a panel like this will tolerate.
It's a good start. Ngozi, solutions.
Solutions. Let me complement what Larry said by maybe putting some specificity to it as far as parts of the world are concerned. I mean, there are some estimates that within the next decade, there will be 600 million youths looking for jobs, and there will be about 200 million jobs. I know someone said they don't like these estimates and so on, but they serve to give you an idea of the magnitude of what we face. So, and this morning, at least the sessions that I happened to come into, talked a lot about jobs and the dignity of jobs. What I learned during my time as a policymaker, 2 times in my country as finance minister, 7 years, and my own interaction with people in my village and so on, is that it's these jobs. I can't say it strong enough. What people are looking for, what you in this room have the capacity to do, again, is going back through your value, your supply chains, to see what can you do to stimulate greater jobs creation, particularly in the developing countries in which you work, particularly in the African countries. There's enormous potential and room to do that. And I know that some companies are looking into that already. So jobs, jobs, jobs for the youth and the women. The second is skills. And I want to add to what Larry said about education. But education is beyond that too. It's about skills, because new types of jobs are being created. We've talked about it here. And it's not clear that the education systems we have now in our countries can deliver for the new type of economy. So what can you do in these countries in where you're creating these services and these goods for sale, to also make sure that the youth, who are coming up have the right type of skills to benefit from the new kinds of jobs. Third, I want to talk about the issue of taxes. Larry argued that you should not try to get monopoly rents, by trying to twist public policy in your favor. I had to deal a lot with that as a finance minister, and to be able to say no. And by the way, it would be good to have the top 100 CEOs from developing countries also somewhere, so you can also pass this kind of message. But apart from that, there's a lot of tax evasion. We studied this in our countries. And I often say, if we could get the estimated $50 to $60 billion escaping my continent, not all of it is tax evasion, but a good deal, or tax avoidance, we don't need the aid. That could just plug the hole in many of our countries to help us create more jobs and employment. And lastly, you're sitting on the edge of your chair, but I have to say this. I saw a number that from 2009, Larry, the salaries of top CEOs in the US increased by 54% at a time. I don't know if that number is right or wrong, but at a time that wages were, not moving, stagnant. If you look all over the world, maybe the figure varies in various parts, but there's a story here. And we also need to think from your perspective of what this means. I heard Cardinal Turkson, and I think an earlier panel, talk about this imbalance. Oh, it was Mo Ibrahim who raised it as I walked in. The imbalance between the increase in pay of the top and those at the bottom who are the workers. So I think there are 3 or 4 things. So beyond philanthropy, I think jobs, jobs, jobs. There are 4 things I've said today that I think you in the room can grapple with.
Thank you. Hernando, solutions.
Solutions. Well, the first thing is for the part of the world that you come from, that I come from, and a great part of the former Soviet Union, we're not in the 21st century. We're in the 19th century. That is the first important thing to take into consideration. Most of the population cannot globalize directly. They'll get some trickle down, and it's obviously not enough. They're rising all over the place. They're getting angry all over the place. It's not only in the Middle East. And just like Mr. Trump has his complaints, they've got the same complaints.
You, I know because I've read your work, you think that we've been talking about technology as a problem in terms of potentially eliminating jobs. You think technology may be a solution to that problem?
Oh, but of course. What you have got now, for example, in systems like blockchain, with the distributed ledgers, actually suits the situation, for example, in the Middle East, now that I think of it. When Bouazizi burnt in Tunisia, in the fair city of Sidi Bouzid, the record-keeping systems in Sidi Bouzid, a town of 38,000 people, were distributed in 9 different informal offices. If you take all the cities of Tunisia together, that means that they've got over 2,300 systems for recording balance sheets, properties, marriages, or whatever. They're in no condition to globalize, not with 2,300 systems that are not written up. The advantages of a system like blockchain, where all of a sudden you turn it around, and instead of making everybody, you use the multiple ledgers, not to go out so everybody makes their contract. You use the technology to actually pick up the non-standardized parts, find out what are their common denominators, which we found out. We boiled them to 21. You could actually start getting the whole world in a record-keeping system. I mean, try and think of the possibility of doing a deal anywhere. Marx said that it took 5,000 pieces to build a locomotive. Try and think of a way to build a locomotive if you don't know who you're buying from or who's doing what.
It's a fascinating idea. I think there's a paper in the packets that you all received or in the email you all received that McKinsey did. Is James Manyika here? I can't see well enough. Yeah, there you are. I believe you were one of the authors of this paper that said that one of the problems is that digitization is still only reached a pretty small layer of society, and that there are great opportunities as we extend digitization more broadly to actually allow other people to participate in globalization in a productive way. Have I got that roughly right?
That's roughly right, Alan. I think what you see is two things. If you look at the advanced economies, within those economies, whether you compare companies or sectors, digitization is fairly uneven. So, for example, in the high-tech industry or financial services, they've got high rates of digitization. But if you look at sectors like healthcare, education, and even parts of retail, digitization is very low. Then if you also compare across companies, you find the same effect. Some companies have become incredibly digitized and others have not, even in the same sector. Then to your point, Alan, if you compare between developed economies and developing economies, there's still so much untapped opportunity and potential to digitize developing economies in ways that will actually help some of the labor market matching kind of examples you're giving, and to take advantage of the kind of innovations at work that Leila and others are doing to enable those market matching. So I think we still have enormous potential both in developed and developing countries to digitize.
Can I add something there?
Yes.
Okay. One is the technology aspect. The other one is that the forces that be, political, religious, are able to understand that that is the issue, that it goes beyond a moral problem. For example, the first person to understand that very well regarding capitalism was a Franciscan friar called Luca Pacioli, who invented the double entry bookkeeping system. Right, and his idea was, if you know what your debts are, if you know what your liabilities are, you know what your credits are, you can then find out what you've got as a margin for capital. That allowed, over time, all of the West to be able to talk to each other when, at the end of the 19th century, you standardized it. Some people say that your crisis of 2008 came because you stopped putting everything in the same books, and you started doing special purpose vehicles. And when Enron went down, it had 3,200 ledgers off the books. Now, wait a second. That all happened because at the time the Catholic Church understood that everybody needed, because equal comes from proportions, proportions come from equality, to be in the books so as to be trusted. And what we have found out as we leave the village, where everything is based on family trust, and all of a sudden get the big wide blue world where nobody knows everything, we're liars.
Yeah,
it's the other side of inventiveness.
It's a good point, and hopefully we'll get into it in more detail in the working groups this afternoon. I'm getting the hook over there on the side, Larry, but you had a quick last comment.
One final thought in terms of things you can think about. I got mugged into this by the students when I was president of Harvard, and at the time I thought they were wrong, but I came over time to think they had a point. Many of us are really proud to be a really good employer. And as a consequence, we don't have that many employees because we hire somebody else to clean the floors, and we hire somebody else to serve some other company to clean the floors and to take care of the food and to do a variety of functions. And what we were led to do was to impose some of the same good employer rules that we used for ourselves as an employer on any contractor we hired. Now, past a certain point, you probably can't make, there's a limit to what rules you can make on people who make your hats, the hats. But when you're talking about the people who take care of the grass and the people who serve the meals and the people who clean the buildings, if people took responsibility for employment standards beyond the people who were just called their employee, it would be a concrete thing that would touch a large number of people, at least in the industrial countries, and I think would be feasible and constructive.
Great, thank you. A great panel. We've just scratched the surface, but thank you for the scratching. We have a lot more to chew on. Thanks.